I'd like to welcome you to our program, Red, Green, and Blue, Qatar's Financial Influence in the West. This is part 6 of our 6-part series with our colleagues at the Middle East Forum, and we're grateful to MEF for all the work they've done with us. We hope that you'll visit AJU's webpage, www.aju.edu, often to see the many exciting programs we have coming up in the future. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've hosted over 200 programs with over 200,000 people who have registered. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Benjamin Baird, who's Director of MEF Action. He's a U.S. Army infantry veteran, and he's published at the National Review, the New York Post, the Jerusalem Post, and other media outlets, and Sam Westrop, who's headed Islamist Watch since March 2017, when MEF absorbed the counterterrorism unit of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, where he was research director. Benjamin and Sam, welcome. So glad that you could join us today.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
I'll be talking with Sam and Benjamin for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll welcome questions from you, the audience. Please begin to submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as possible. Benjamin, Sam, let's begin with a pretty basic question. Qatar is a country about the size of Hawaii. It has a population of about 3 million people, which would make it a sizable suburb of Los Angeles, but we're talking about it on the world stage. Maybe you could begin by saying, what is their grand strategy? What does Qatar actually want?
It's an excellent question. And understanding the ideology of Qatar, you would think, would help with this. But what a lot of analysts, indeed policymakers and journalists, have often failed to realize that Qatar is a Wahhabi state. We often think of Wahhabism when we think Saudi Arabia, but Qatar is also Wahhabi. But like Saudi, its efforts to influence are not necessarily always along Wahhabi lines. In other words, it doesn't fund other Wahhabi Muslims around the world. It funds Islamists and Muslims of many different sects, many different stripes. So Qatar's ideological agenda as it relates to Islam, or indeed Islamism, is mysterious in some ways. It seems to be willing to work with people from different schools of jurisprudence, different schools of thought. If it's aiming to build a caliphate, usually the goal of an Islamist movement, then one wonders who exactly would be involved in this caliphate if Qatar is willing to embrace such a big tent. At the very least, however, despite the ideological, the disparate ideological approach, we can say that Qatar likes power. It likes to influence, it likes to control, and it certainly likes its wealth. And we see that in the West. We see Qatari influence and money in everything from universities and schools to investment banks and real estate portfolios. Qatar works to impose itself, despite its minuscule size, in all aspects of the American polity. And indeed, it's no coincidence that Qatar is now hosting both the head of Mossad and the CIA director as they try to work out a new deal, because Qatar has positioned itself as that mediator, despite its long-standing support for Islamists, its long-standing support for terror.
Benjamin, maybe you could explain to the audience Qatar's ideological position, given that it both hosts Hamas and hosts a major U.S. air base and has hosted many of the negotiations to end the war in Gaza. Where is it? Who is it allied with, or is it murkier than that?
Sure. Well, Qatar's in a position where it has to navigate a tightrope. It has to walk in between both camps. On one side, the Islamist and pro-terror regimes around the Middle East. On the other side, it wants to very much be part of Western-style democracies. And it does this by using its immense wealth, first to fund terrorist movements around the world, but on the other hand, to use that money, that immense wealth, through lobbying, attempting to influence Western education systems, and investments in Western corporations it uses that money very much to sanitize its image with the West. They are masters of PR in Qatar. And so, it's able to walk through both of these worlds, both of these camps. But Qatar should definitely be listed not as a major non-NATO ally, as it was under the Biden administration beginning in 2021, but it should be listed among states like Iran, North Korea, Syria, Russia, China, these American adversaries. Qatar is definitely an enemy of the United States and Western values, but it uses money, as I say, to fool the West and to reside in both camps at once.
And I'll point out that this duplicity is not unique to Qatar. Islamists have done this for decades. In fact, even here in the West, a number of very prominent Hamas networks are allies in some ways of the state. They have served as informants, intelligence assets for years. And Western governments accept this because they see a greater threat in Salafi jihad, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, so choose to look the other way to some extent when working with Hamas networks. It's exactly the same with Qatar. Western policymakers know what Qatar is, they know what it does, but they see it as a strategic asset, wrongly, in our opinion.
Sam and Benjamin, this program is about influence, Qatar's influence on the West. So getting to the topic, maybe you could talk about from Qatar's point of view, how do you influence the West?
Yeah, this is the question.
What is its perspective?
Yeah, so I mentioned Saudi earlier, and were we having this webinar 2 decades ago, no doubt the subject would be Saudi rather than Qatar, because everyone remembers Saudi money flowing into American mosques, European mosques, indeed American and Western Islamic institutions more broadly. Saudi stopped that game in around 2012, 2013, when it began to turn against groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and began to regard them as a threat to their own power. Qatar stepped in, but they looked at what Saudi had been doing and thought they'd taken too broad an approach. The Saudis funded everyone, every kind of radical, indeed moderates as well. They just gave money to everyone in the hope that they could push the Saudi model of Islam, this Wahhabist ideal, to Muslims across the world. It didn't really work. Yes, they helped spread radicalism, but they didn't win loyalty, as they found out during the Arab Spring. So Qatar has taken a very different approach. In Doha, they thought, best not to fund mosques and Islamic institutions directly, best to help set up an environment that is conducive to Islamist ideals and ultimately benefits us, the Qataris. Now, I think in over the decade that I've been studying Qatari influence in the West, I've only come across, I think I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen direct Qatari funding to an American Islamic institution in the last decade. The fact is, Qatar does not directly fund American Islam. There's a few examples, a whole collection of $1 million worth of Qurans going to a group called the Thurquan Foundation in Illinois, some money moving through Canada from Qatar and then coming to a radical Salafi mosque in Colorado. But apart from that, really, a few examples. In general, you don't find Qatari patronage in the way you found Saudi patronage. What you do see, however, is enormous amounts of Qatari money working its way into non-Muslim institutions, into media, into universities, into banks. And these institutions, with their Qatari patronage, then become awfully friendly to domestic Islamists. And so Ben has some good examples. I'll turn to him now, but just very quickly, Georgetown University, I think, is a great example of this. It takes an enormous amount of Qatari money, billions of dollars of Qatari money. And with that money, it sets up groups like the Bridge Initiative, which work to identify what they call Islamophobic networks around the West. To do this, they employ Islamists. They work with the Qatari regime, the Turkish regime. They push Islamism through this small academic institute within Georgetown University, thanks to Qatari patronage. So it's this indirect support that helps spread Islamism, spread radicalism and anti-Semitism through the country. But Ben, I think you have some prominent examples as it relates to other Western institutions.
Yeah, I think just looking at traditional forms of lobbying, one of the best examples we have is from 2017. This is when Qatar was facing an anti-Qatar blockade from many of its neighbors, from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. It was finding itself shut off, and the Trump administration was backing its adversaries in this effort. Trump was very outspoken and going after Qatar for its international sponsorship of terrorism and its inability to play ball when it came to efforts like anti-money laundering across the West. And so what happened at this time was two political operatives with connections in the GOP, Joey Alaham and Nick Musin, approached Qatar with what was ultimately a very unorthodox proposal. They wanted to go after Trump influencers with Qatari money, try to arrange trips abroad in Doha, try to get them to see things from Qatar's perspective. Ultimately, they reached targets like Mike Huckabee, Alan Dershowitz, New York real estate mogul Steve Witkoff, people that had very close access to the Trump administration. Some people speculate that as much as $1.5 billion was spent on this effort. A much smaller number is what is reported. But in any case, they were ultimately very successful in this endeavor. Trump turned his position very quickly. He pointed to Qatari investments in American aviation. He soon after allowed joint counterterrorism partnerships with Qatar to move forward, started sending military assistance to Qatar. And so they were very successful in this endeavor, and they continued to this day. Now, the focus nowadays seems to be for Qatar to get the West to look the other way when it comes to its support for Hamas. And most people will point to the $1.8 billion that Qatar sent to Hamas since 2014. I think that's a mistake. That money was supervised by Israel and the United States. They didn't ask for that money. Prior to 2014, the money was unsupervised going into Gaza and Hamas from Qatar. But it came from the foolhardy misconception that they could buy, buy peace with Hamas, which proved, to be wrong in the long term. And so, that's what their main focus is today. But the majority of terror finance coming from Qatar doesn't come from these out in the open funding of Hamas. It comes from private wealthy donors inside of Qatar that the government allows to continue funding al-Nusra Front, al-Qaeda affiliates, and Hamas around the world, because it doesn't have the laws or the judiciary in place or the political will to prosecute these people. And that's where
the exception to that, Ben, by the way, is
Sure.
in Gaza, where you do see Qatari government institutions themselves handling the money and funneling money through to the Dawa movement, unlike, as you point out, Jabhat al-Nusra or other terror groups in Syria and elsewhere, which, as you say, are funded by private businessmen.
Yes, yeah.
I'll be talking with Sam and Benjamin for about 5 more minutes and then get the questions from you, the audience. Sam and Benjamin, one of the most interesting and explosive aspects of this discussion is Qatar's influence on Western media. And maybe you could say a few words about that.
Well, I'll turn over to Ben in a second to talk about Al Jazeera, because that's the elephant in the room. Ben spoke earlier about the growing efforts by the Qataris to reach out to conservative figures. By the way, Jewish institutions were also part of targeted in that effort. And there are quite a few. I think your listeners might be aware of a few of them. There were some rather famous examples of Jewish leaders going to Doha to meet with the Qataris because of this effort. But media was, I think, the most interesting, because and as Ben will discuss, while Al Jazeera and these Qatari media efforts very much initially came from the left and pushed a progressivist line, at least in their English language Western programming, Qatar's made a serious effort to influence conservative media over the last few years as well. Indeed, we found a number of very interesting pro-Qatar columnists in places like the Washington Times, a conservative newspaper. And indeed, one of their one of their columnists rather openly consorting with the Qatari royal family and seemingly taking money from them to run prominent puff pieces. So this happens a lot, and he wouldn't be the first. Qatar's also made a number of efforts to set up right-wing media stations in the West, but perhaps where it's been most successful alongside Al Jazeera is in influencing Middle East studies and Middle East reporting, with the establishment of papers like the New Arab or Middle East Eye, which go after critics of Qatar, critics of Islamism, and try to push the Qatari view of the Middle East in journalistic circles. And they do that very well, partly by recruiting, like Al Jazeera, partly by recruiting from within Western newsrooms. And it's been very successful the way they've done that. And it's really where you find journalism meeting Western Islamism is through the medium of media, because that's exactly where you find radicals tied to Hamas, tied to South Asian Islamists like Jamaat-e-Islami, tied to Salafis and so on, working with, writing with, sharing opinions with, and platforms and column inches with reputable journalists and reputable academics. And that's Qatar in a nutshell, using these institutions to legitimize, to mainstream radicals in the West and to subvert once proudly reputable institutions such as the media, such as academia. But Al Jazeera is the most interesting. And Ben, I think you're best placed to talk about that. Your expertise on this is well noted.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to briefly state, Al Jazeera is a very large media conglomerate. It has Al Jazeera Arabic, it has an Al Jazeera International, which it's known for its Al Jazeera English channel. These are separate in the way they go about things. For instance, Al Jazeera Arabic will be blatantly anti-Semitic in its rhetoric, blatantly anti-American and anti-Western. Al Jazeera Arabic walks a finer line where it will refer to Zionism rather than Judaism, so they hide their biases in that way when they're talking to Western audiences. AJ Plus is a digital media outlet that started a few years back. However, the Department of Justice under the Trump administration sought to get it to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Qatar simply thumbed its nose at that request and has not to this day registered as a foreign agent. It continues to do so. The Biden administration refuses to hold Qatar accountable in that regard, despite numerous congressional efforts, letters, attempts to get the Biden administration to hold them accountable, and they have not. So I think that's the important thing to keep in mind, that this is a foreign-controlled, state-controlled media outlet that has been asked by American law enforcement, by the federal government, to come clear about its foreign ties, and it does not do so and does not face any consequences for that.
I have to ask, because we're at American Jewish University. Sam, you mentioned Georgetown, but maybe you could summarize what's the long play in terms of Qatar and American universities? What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, if you look at institutions like the Qatar Foundation, which is a Doha-based institution, on the one hand, they host Education City, as it's called, in Doha, which is an enormous campus of campuses. This is where all of the American universities with campuses in Doha are based. So the Qatar Foundation runs that. But here in the US, they operate an entity called Qatar Foundation International, QFI. And QFI helps to manipulate and influence curricula and teachings of Arabic, about Qatar, about the Middle East, about Muslims in universities and also in K-12 schools, public K-12 schools, in fact. And it comes with lots of free gifts for cash-strapped education systems around the country. So they happily accept this. But in terms of the universities, they will happily work with Qatar Foundation, whether these universities have bad actors or not guiding these decisions. Because this brings money, this brings partnerships, this brings nice trips to Doha, and once you're into Doha, you start visiting Muslim capitals around the world. So there's all sorts of advantages to becoming a pro-Doha or a Doha-aligned academic. And indeed, you see how successful this has been for Qatar. You see these the universities that have set up these institutions in Doha, on academics that have aligned themselves with Qatari institutions. You see them with their own journals, their own books and papers published now by a growing industry of Qatar-aligned publishers and other infrastructure. It really is an industry within an industry, the Qatari influence over American universities. Now, given there was such a backlash in previous years against foreign funding of Western universities, especially in Europe, and you might remember during the Arab Spring, there's a furor over the amount of money from Libya and other places going into Western universities. I hope this will eventually happen in the US too. The US has the tools to stop this. They have Section 117, which requires universities to report foreign funding. They have rules on foreign agents that require anyone lobbying or trying to change policy to report a foreign principal and so on. There are the tools that exist, and currently the rules are perhaps not being enforced as tightly as they can. Public uproar about this would certainly help with that. Certainly pressure Congress to pressure the executive. There's a huge problem. It's broadly ignored, and universities are more than willing to look the other way. And as was discovered under the Trump administration as well, it seems they've massively underreported the true amount of Qatari money and influence coming their way.
And
Sam and Benjamin, maybe we could get to questions from the audience. Benjamin, throw this to you. Several members of the audience are asking about the role of Iran in all of this and Qatar's relationship with Iran. It's a Sunni state, as Sam said at the beginning, but it's in a geographic position. So is Iran influencing them? Are they a bulwark against Iran? How do you define it?
Yeah, I think traditionally there were reasons to think that Iran and Qatar could have had some rivalries, but in recent years there have been some high-level meetings between Qatar officials and Iran, and we've seen them come even closer to one another since the October 7th attacks in Israel. And I think that's a trend that we will see continue over time. They have interests that align, especially in support of groups like Hamas. So this is a dangerous alliance that we should keep our eyes on, certainly.
I think that, as well as Hamas, also hostility to Saudi is a point that unites both Qatar and Iran. In fact, that probably dominates the friendship between the two. However, it is a complicated relationship, Qatar and Iran, and not just because of the sectarian history, but because not everything Iran does is in Qatar's interest and vice versa. So it is an awkward relationship. And you see that in the way that Al Jazeera and other media covers Iran. You also see that in the West with the proxies of Iran and Qatar. We note very little collaboration in the West between Qatari and Iranian proxies. And that's interesting, actually.
And there's been something of a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran in recent years, recent months, actually. It may be that Qatar is somewhat responsible for this.
A lot of great questions. Let me read you one, which is particularly insightful. A member of the audience writes, conservative politicians that I speak to seem to think that Qatar is like Saudi Arabia, and that we can slowly move them closer to the West by closer ties diplomacy, rather than harsh steps by ending their status as a major non-NATO ally. Do you agree or disagree with that approach?
I mean, disagree most vehemently, but I don't disagree. That's what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. And as I mentioned before, it's like intelligence, the security establishment treating Hamas networks as potential informants in pursuit of a greater counterterrorism policy. It's the same thing happening here. And it's not a new idea among certain Western policymakers that they can appease their way to peace or they can moderate their way to peace. When you have states or entities driven by an ideological dogma that is so destructive and so hateful and so violent, it is madness to think you can moderate that. And yet time and time again, Western governments try to do it. Obama tried with the Muslim Brotherhood. He stopped funding the liberals. He started pouring support into the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in the belief, the genuine belief, I think, that he could create a moderate political Islam. He could create theocracy that the West could control. And this was foolish to think that an ideology founded in opposition to the West could ever be controlled by the West. And they're doing the same with Qatar. They do the same with Iran, as you've seen under Obama and Biden. And indeed, you even see that with the Trump administration and Turkey. So this is not unique to Qatar. And yes, it is an astute observation, noting that conservative politicians say this. They're wrong, and it's a pity that we don't really have a political force in the country that is taking a really sensible approach to foreign policy at the moment.
Benjamin, what's the view from Riyadh of Qatar now?
Well, I think that some of the old problems certainly haven't gone away. Riyadh looks at Qatar as a nation that supports Islamist movements around the world, and as a result, it views this as a direct threat to its legitimacy. So it will continue opposing Qatar in that regard. Now, Riyadh and Qatar were among many states in the Gulf that decided.
We appear to have lost Ben, but I'll continue from what he was saying, at least what I hope he was about to say, which is that, the relationship is tempestuous. I mentioned earlier that Saudi turned against the Brotherhood and other Islamist groups some 10 years ago. And under MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the current Saudi, ruler, he has taken a very hardline anti-Islamist position. And he sees Qatar as the source of most of the problems of this war. The blockade of Qatar has ended. There has been détente, as Ben was pointing out. I would be surprised, however, if we didn't see a resumption of some form of diplomatic hostility or other hostilities between Saudi and Qatar at some point. Ben, you're back. Sorry, do you want to finish your point?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that Riyadh, just like Doha, was one of several countries that said they would not allow the U.S. To make airstrikes against Iran using its military facilities. So in that way, you've seen some coming together, but I don't see the hostilities going away in the long term. Islamism is a direct threat to monarchies, Gulf monarchies. They look at it as a threat to their grip on power. They use social welfare to buy over their populations. And if they have radicalized populations, it threatens their long-term legitimacy. So until Qatar stops supporting terrorism, Saudi Arabia will not be its friend.
Benjamin and Sam, we're just about out of time for a fascinating conversation, but several members of the audience have asked, and I agree this is the critical departing question. What are the most important steps that you believe the West could take to counter Qatar's influence operations?
Well, for a start, remove all military forces from Qatar, stop giving them the legitimacy as a non-NATO ally. Enforce the law, stop foreign agents such as Al Jazeera from manipulating and influencing Western policies. Go after other foreign agents within finance, within politics, and so on. Qatar has a very important think tank here called Dawn that operates openly in DC and does a lot of damage. So there's a huge amount that the West can do. The problem is fundamentally shifting the West's mindset about the problem of Islamism and the severity of Qatari influence.
Benjamin, last word?
Yeah, I think we should pass reforms like the Deterrent Act, which is currently up in Congress, which would require that countries like Qatar that are viewed as ideological adversaries have to report any amount of financing in U.S. higher education institutions. There's also no reason that Al Jazeera should have more members of the congressional press corps than do the Washington Post and the New York Times combined. So we need to put an end to that. We need to start upholding foreign influence laws in this country. And if we do so, we can curtail some of Qatar's influence.
Sam Westrop, Benjamin Baird, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. And thanks to your colleagues at the Middle East Forum also for working with us on this 6-part series, Red, Green, and Blue, on Islam's influence in the West. And I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us for another fascinating discussion. We overcame the technological gremlins, and I think presented the kind of informed discussion which AJU hopes to sponsor often. Please go to our website, www.aju.edu, to see the many exciting programs we have coming up in the future, and I hope that you'll join us for as many as possible. This is Jeffrey Herbst, President of American Jewish University, thanking you again. Thank you, Sam and Benjamin, for a fascinating discussion.